Good morning. Welcome. Hope you're all stretched and waking up and ready to go. We have a great lineup here in the hall for you this morning. If you guys were not here yesterday and heard the announcement about the chairs, which may have surprised you when you came in, this beautiful green stadium seating that we have, the building is being renovated soon, and the chairs are the first evidence of this. And so these are our temporary seats, so I hope you'll bear with us while that is being changed. And in exchange, there are masseuses here to give you a massage. You can go and talk to them to the right of the registration counter if you need a little recovery from these chairs. Another couple of announcements. The brand talks that are happening in show today, often they're very crowded, so we have a live stream for those of you who cannot get into those sessions, and that's in the restaurant. You can get headphones where the translation headphones are, and take those to the restaurant, see the live stream, and it's channel 1 on those headphones to see that. This evening, here in the hall is a screening of Graphic Means presented by Briar Levitt, the director. I've seen the film a couple of times, really wonderfully done. It's a great documentary on a period of design that is often glossed over, that period in between the metal type era and the digital era, and I think it's very fascinating, so I recommend you guys see that. And on that same note, just outside here, as you're coming into the hall, there is an exhibit that we brought from San Francisco, Letterform Archive, which shows a lot of this kind of process work, analog process work, that kind of tells the story of how designs came to be. So as you're coming and going to the hall, make sure you check out that exhibit just outside the doors here. That's enough announcements. Let's get into our program. There are some people whose opinion, whose take on the matters of the day, you can't wait to hear. Our next speaker is one of those people for me. She always has powerful and pointed insight on the world of design, and she never pulls punches. She's the vice president at the Type Directors Club in New York. You can see her latest ideas in a really interesting video interview online about the impact of a designer's age on their career. And you can see her latest design and her writing in a really great type specimen from Commercial Type that was recently released. She's a designer, she's a mother, she's a badass. She's a badass mother designer. Elizabeth Carey Smith.
I'm ECS. As Stephen said, I'm primarily a graphic designer and a typographer, and I trained as a designer first and foremost. And then a few years ago, well, several years ago now, I found myself at this kind of cross-section of design and art direction for fashion. And I found it fascinating. I didn't really know anything about fashion photography or art direction. I had always come to my work from a place of design and type. And so along the way, I started gathering these kind of insights and observations, and I ended up really falling in love with this aspect of design and art direction. Type and Couture is a talk about the way that we've used both type and fashion to express how we feel about ourselves and how we feel about others and how we feel about seeing and being seen. This is about how type and fashion live alongside each other, for better or for worse. And typography informs and it expresses, but it's mostly literal. While fashion is more nebulous, the interpretations of fashion are broader. Fashion is about image, perception, hyper self-awareness. Fashion communicates lifestyles and the aspirations of life visually. In an interview with Lester Bangs, the writer and punk musician Richard Hell once said, "If you invent yourself, you love yourself." The idea of inventing yourself is creating the most ideal image that you could imagine. And fashion is about self-invention and self-expression, the secure and insecure ways that we reflect ourselves to ourselves and to others. It's like why we can mock fashion and revere it for its seriousness about itself, because it can be really obtuse. But it also has the ability to help someone understand who they are to the rest of the world. It was funny when I started working on this talk because a lot of people were like, are you just going to snark about type in fashion? Because there's a lot of careless type in fashion. It can be disappointing to see how fashion often doesn't feel very smart when it comes to type. Its emphasis on image has often relegated type to this awkward place. It's clunky, and contrary to the photography, which is diligently crafted and directed, the type that accompanies it usually feels really ignorant or careless. In making fashion images, people use the same words over and over again: feminine, delicate, decadent. And there's a parallel with type. Creative and art directors, not to mention clients, request type all the time that's beautiful, delicate, feminine. And I've always had to pause to figure out what that actually means. 95% of the time, those descriptors are describing a high-contrast modern serif. It's describing Didons, Didot or Bodoni or something of its ilk. But it's usually one of those, and I can't ever recall someone specifying which Didot or which Bodoni. And it's because being specific about type and its qualities makes art directors nervous, because typographers have a reputation for making that a contentious conversation. Anyway, those descriptors can be problematic, not because those words and femininity are bad, but because it becomes the only way that we can describe things to and about women. For example, I don't like the word sexy when it is used to describe type, any more than I like the word delicious to describe anything that isn't food. It's just creepy. But I digress. So I began with this simple thesis to determine, turn my images back on, someone. I was trying to determine, there it is.
Oh, okay.
Thanks. I was trying to determine where and why and how Didons became so prevalent in fashion and who initiated this, because it wasn't these dudes. Somewhere along the way, high-contrast Didons became this kind of language of typography. So I began my research where I thought it should start. Vogue. In the beginning, there was Vogue. This is its first issue from 1892. Haute couture itself was implemented in Paris in 1858, nearly 40 years prior, by the Englishman Charles Frederick Worth. Haute couture, by definition, is high-end fashion that's constructed by hand from start to finish, made from high-quality, expensive, often unusual fabric, sewn with extreme attention to detail, and finished by the most experienced and capable sewers. Vogue's purpose at its inception was to celebrate the ceremonial side of life, which was to say that it was for American aristocrats and all the weird shit that they were interested in. And when I started this research, I quickly noticed that the typography was a lot more complex than what I'd assumed. So here we see this interlocking O and G, no images on the cover, from 1907. And some weird loopy lettering from 1911 on an editorial spread. And you can also see these two Didon V's used as a kind of ornament behind the ladies. So this was just prior to the arrival of editor Edna Woolman Chase, who manned the editorial helm from 1914 to 1951. A very deco cover from 1924. And some more deco 5 years later. This is from 1929, which was a significant year. This was when M.F. Aga, a Russian-born Turk, became the art director of Vogue. Condé Nast had met Aga in Europe. He was the art director of Vogue Berlin. And he became fascinated by the man and his overt process about how to make a magazine. Aga believed that art direction was not purely ornament, but an essential part of how a magazine should be built, its foundation. This marked a change. Design was no longer regarded as a decorative adjunct or as gifted mechanical skill, but as an organic function of the modern publication. Aga also brought with him the geometric sans serifs that were the prevailing fashion in Europe. He introduced a lot of the modernist sensibilities of the Deco period from Europe, and these spreads are from the heart of that time, 1933 and 1934. These typefaces were largely unused in the US. I don't know for certain how these typefaces might have gotten here. Either trays of them were brought over on steamships, which is just an excellent thought, or knockoffs were made and electroformed at some stage. But either way, Futura and Bodoni became these two primary themes that I had assumed of fashion typography, and for a lot of good reasons. Aga was responsible for what was called a purified typographic style. And these settings of Vogue, when we look at them, they feel comfortable. They're what we assume about fashion typography. But in looking just at covers, we see that it was a long time in coming, this kind of precedent. First, there were hundreds and thousands of experiments in editorial. This is from 1939, and we discover this lovely condensed script in the beginning of a real time of experimentation with the Vogue logo. The covers from this point were all illustrated by different illustrators who would take over the issue's tone of voice or sense of humor. They're like Instagram takeovers of their time, but the illustrators weren't influencers who were like making you feel bad about your life. This is another from 1939, so you can start to see how different they are from cover to cover. There's this freedom and autonomy that was given to those that they commissioned to draw these covers. And this variation continues throughout this period, but they didn't seem to have a problem either with just repeating lettering styles if they liked them either. So this is quite similar to the previous issue, but painted with a thicker brush. And this is my least favorite. I love Benito's illustrations, but this one seemed like a Matisse hack, which is, I show this because I think it's a good time to point out that fashion is all about appropriation and straight up theft. Fashion begets fashion and style begets style, and we'll see examples of this throughout these images. Again, from 1939, demonstrating how much experimentation was going on and what was being tried. This is all this buildup of a typographic style for fashion, but this hasn't really established anything yet. So here's that condensed script again from 6 issues prior, but the subject matter changes drastically. And this one has such a great drop shadow, which is a hard thing to be good at. Drop shadows are strange, but the typographic shadow mimics the hard shadow of the foliage that's not even in the frame. So this variation in style makes these issues feel special and collectible. And it's important to note that at this point, Vogue was coming out twice a month. So this was a lot of very different work that was being generated. This one was done by Salvador Dali, no big deal, which is like a clear indication that fashion was intertwined with culture and art, and it was unafraid to make these connections. In fact, it established itself as fine art, as a high art. It created this direct parallel for itself, and that's another thing that fashion does. It injects itself where you least expect it. Along with that element of surprise and its ability to create these hostile takeovers of one's lifestyle is its craftsmanship, and all of that combined does indeed qualify fashion as a fine art. So these slides, for the most part, are in chronological order to demonstrate what styles led to what in the search for a typographic style that would eventually stick. Here are those condensed scripts from the beginning of the year incorporating photography, and another total departure with all of this detail and vivid color. And all of these painterly, loose logos just stand in service of the paintings. It's never about branding this magazine. The fashion ends up being an interpretation. They're not showing literal dresses from the time period. It's a demonstration of style. These are some of the most unusual ones, these colors and composition and this weird Tuscan-esque diamond slicing the word in half. But what this was starting to do was establish a foreground and a background between the logo and the image itself. So if I'd shown this one just in isolation without these others that preceded it, it would just look like a great classic fashion magazine cover. But knowing what we do now about previous covers, it's astonishing that the style changed so dramatically and that photography and illustration and painting were freely used interchangeably without care to branding. Because of course, the next issue, which is mid-October of 1939, these were all in the same year, come back to this style, and then abandon all of that precedent to go into this full bifurcated, super ornamented Tuscan logo spanning the width of the cover using this amazing compositional photography. For the Christmas Gifts issue of 1939, the amazing Cipe Pinellas constructed the Vogue logo out of jewelry. This is Cipe. This is farther into her career, during which she worked as an art director for Glamour and 17 and Charm magazine. This is once this kind of Didon precedent was kind of settled in. So this is 1940. This ends that kind of period of that painterly experimentation. And at this point in my research, it was safe to say that my thesis about the typographic language of fashion seemed naively shallow. The complexity and the daring of these logos and covers up to this point stand in such stark contrast to how we think of fashion magazines today. This particular compressed square logo is another experiment in geometry and echoes the totalitarian undercurrents happening in Western Europe at the time. So I'll flip through several covers from 1940. You can just see that this experimentation really doesn't let up during this time. These French Clarendons, a compressed high contrast serif, a stencil, it was war times, human letters, I love this one. And this is by the aforementioned Benito, Eduardo Garcia Benito, who illustrated tons of Vogue covers from the 1920s onward. So now in August of 1940, this is when we see this fat-faced Didon appear, and we're starting to see what maybe is the impetus for the Vogue logo that we know now. And this is 2 weeks later, some experimentation with letter spacing. We're back to the compressed. Can you imagine the office politics that would happen today if this kind of change happened twice a month? And this was all analog. So 1 year after the Cipe Pinellas cover, the Christmas Gifts cover of 1940 brings us something quite similar to what we're used to thinking of with Vogue. And the next month, in 1941, in January, Vogue and America are at war together. But then they just let that go because it's summertime and they're going to do the script and have beach ball as the O. So skipping ahead a few years, the interior spreads were noticeably adopting the high contrast Didons, for sure for copy, if not for further experimentation with the logo on the contents page, that beautiful G. So what else was happening, and was this unique to Vogue? Carmel Snow was an editor at Vogue who went over to Bazaar and was responsible for the hiring of Alexei Brodovich, another Russian art director. And he began his career at Harper's Bazaar in 1934 and stayed there for 24 years. Bazaar literally means a mixture of styles, which was apropos for a modernist vision that blended the art of clothing with photography and art and music. Taking the principles of Vogue that celebrated strong photography and typography, Snow also hired photographer Martin Munkaci and the illustrator Erte. So there's this clear sensibility for typography and composition from Brodovich. Specifically, he uses scale and typographic color to guide these very constructivist, modernist principles. And some of these finds were sketches, which I was really happy about, being able to see that process. It makes you wonder how we'll understand the creative process now when we don't have these physical sheets of revisions and sketches archived. But this helps us to understand how these designers thought about space and foreground and background. Among the photographers that Brodovich hired were European artists like Man Ray. This established a precedent for typography to follow the lead of the photography, which was basically the best way to get photographers to trust him. Prior to this, and even today, there's a fear of how typography will interact with photography or get in its way because they often impede each other. They run alongside each other and they don't often integrate very well. What seems like it would be an effortless gesture of one following the other is in fact carefully crafted. That it occurred in somewhat of a system and followed a visual language is actually truly remarkable. These major scale changes really played with the ability of typography to create drama. This typography forces you to notice this figure. If the type just lived in straight columns, would we notice the sharp angle of the pose? Which is to say that the photography and the typography are codependent in good layouts. I included this one just because I love looking at images of this model, Penelope Tree. She was this odd, captivating woman to look at, and the angles that she would use her body to make in these kind of gestural poses kind of really informed the typography that lived around the images. So again, here's this vertical New York, and it makes you understand how bold the foreground of this photograph is, even though the depth of the field is focused on the car in the background. So this is also an interesting experiment in handmade grotesque sands, by the way. Here's an example of how type and space and image were all married on a front cover. I love how he looked at the very graphic nature of the double A's and used it to the advantage of the photograph. This is a photograph by Richard Avedon. He was another photographer whose sculptural compositions suited Brodovich's typography entirely. They really went hand in hand. And we look at these figures, these women and their shapes, and it's no wonder that we use words like feminine and graceful and elegant and beautiful when we describe typography that we use to communicate fashion. The photographic precedents were establishing high contrast foregrounds and backgrounds and emphasizing silhouettes, so there's this very natural inclination to align this with typography. Brodovich was succeeded by Henry Wolff in 1957, and that magazine's reputation for unique type and art direction was maintained throughout. If we skip forward to 1982, this brings us to Fabian Baron, a designer and art director who's arguably the most famous modern-day example of someone who extended and expanded the visual language that fashion has articulated. Born in Paris to an art director father, Baron grew up in publishing. And like so many great stories, he came to New York with next to nothing, and through talent and persistence and being a white male, he rose to the top of editorial design. Fabian Baron's work is almost all in unique reverence to the typographic traditions and fashion that we've just covered. His work is almost in this kind of mimicking way of what he saw as fashion's precedent, even when it wasn't intending to be that precedent. His work at Harper's Bazaar and then Interview magazine, where he's still currently the art director, involved making Dido even more sculptural. He made it even more contrasty and dramatic. These hairlines become so thin they snap. In fact, when you look at some of the printing quality of some of these magazines, you can see that a lot of those hairlines don't really hold up. Another from Interview magazine. And a book that he designed on Kate Moss, where the type integrates even more with the image. So these opportunities to make compound shapes out of the letters, such as in the K and the A and the M, they all attempt to create this seamless typographic, photographic composition. So one of the things that we start to see is this overlapping of strokes, particularly in Barron's work, but you'll see later on that there's a precedent for it. Here it extended into sans serifs for beauty packaging and branding. And finally, Futura joins the language with Calvin Klein, and we saw Helvetica with the NARS packaging. And that's because the precedent for beauty, which we won't get into beyond this, but beauty involves a lot of sans serifs, especially those based on calligraphy like Optima. Optima is this kind of hybrid tonally because its stroke contrast is not grotesque, and yet it doesn't have serifs to define it as such. In other words, it has that high contrast that we like out of the Didones, lending itself to what we define as elegant. Futura and other sans serifs have coexisted with Didones, of course, in fashion typography since the beginning. This is hand-drawn, this isn't Futura, but it's effectively the same thing from 1929. And these interior spreads. And there were other titles going way back to the 20s as well that were using Futura and other geometric sans. This is Vogue in the 80s, which started to rock all Futura at this point. Elle magazine launched in 1945 in France, but when it launched in the US in 1975, it launched only with Futura. I interviewed Elle's former design director, who was responsible for the current redesign of Elle, and Evan Campisi, and he described the magazine as this indie magazine coming to mainstream fashion magazines. He said it's decidedly unladylike compared to your classic upmarket Upper East Side set. And Futura claims the voice of downtown fashion and culture. In fact, it's transcended just Futura and moved clearly into grotesque territory. Because Dido, in the minds of younger magazines and their audiences, that felt like the old definition of luxury. Street style has risen to prominence, and collections are now tribes. Prominent fashion designers now originally made their names in minimalism or in street style. So in fact, grotesques in general are now common amongst street style fashion magazines who are selling a lifestyle even more than clothing. Campisi described the use of those geometric sans as integral to Elle being faster, big, and bold. And it's strategic because it's consciously designed for social engagement. What looks good Instagrammed? What feels youthful? Futura, he told me, feels fit. And this isn't specifically Futura, it's a custom derivative, but its purposes feel the same. It's a departure from the Didones. So along with the previous slide, we see all these broad interpretations now of type in the editorial world. Commercial type in New York City developed Giorgio, which pulls from a lot of the descriptors we'd use for fashion type. High contrast, round geometry, these perpendicular serifs, rectangular widths. So it's borrowing from the contrastiness of Didones as well as the modern serifs, and it's also sharp and crisp and quirky. The geometry starts to borrow from what we like about Futura from the scene, near circular rounds and rectangular widths. And then they made a sans. And then they also developed this typeface Schneider, which was just recently publicly released for T, the New York Times Style magazine, in 2013, which embraces, again, a lot of those components of fashion typography, this time with these full sets of odd widths that make this very exciting texture. So we've thrown off this idea now of this Upper East Side fashion set. And it still brings us back, though, to not just how we're communicating fashion in editorial, but how the labels themselves identify themselves. So haute couture, which is bespoke and tailored, was implemented in Paris in 1958, as I said. And then Coco Chanel opened her shop with haute couture in 1919. And we consider her to be, truly, the impetus for haute couture. But we have to back up for 1 second, because we have to acknowledge that long before Coco Chanel opened up her shop on Rue Cambon, Hermès opened way back in 1837, and Louis Vuitton in 1854. This was kind of before we even identified what haute couture was. These were not clothing stores. They were fancy leather goods stores, bags, trunks, luggage, saddles. And the interesting thing about this is that leather goods required an actual physical brand to mark their wares. So it made sense that a logo like this, reminiscent of a metalsmith's or a potter's hallmark, would take shape. But Coco Chanel made dresses and coats and shirts, not leather goods, but still, she must have wanted to adopt the language of the high-end leather goods, maybe because they paired so well with her clothing. This logo has never been changed. It's almost 100 years old. So just 2 years after Coco, in 1921, Gucci, which is the perfect name for a shoe villain if there was ever one, opened his shop of fine leather goods in Florence. Shoes and handbags run nearly concurrently with dressmaking and expert tailoring. And this was his logo. So it's been tweaked a bit since then, but just to this. So this is where this comes from, the beginnings of couture, really. There was this precedent of appropriation, or even just an utmost faith in that precedent. The reasons behind the decisions don't satisfy our graphic design minds, which want to problem solve for a label, because there's all these tonal opportunities for a fashion label. It's so expressive, and yet the type is very controlled and it's very derivative. Fashion, like all art, is a leap. It requires an enormous outpouring of money and materials and creativity and resources, all with the hope that someone will spend a lot of money on it so that makers can recoup their costs. So while they have to take chances with their creative visions in order to succeed, they don't dare extend that to the brand's graphic identity. My friend Nick, who's now working with Fabian Baron at Interview, had some good insight to this. He said you can't sell this notion of luxury without mirroring some notion of that luxury. And the best way to do that is to make it feel or sound or look like Chanel or Louis Vuitton. Between the 1920s and 1950s in Paris, the labels we most associate with high-end fashion were born. Hermès, Louis Vuitton, Lanvin, Balmain, Chanel, Gucci, Givenchy, Christian Dior, and Balenciaga. These labels formed the nexus of Parisian haute couture in its golden age, and their visual identities were of a decided language. So strong were these that the new designers in the 50s and onward who contributed to haute couture also emulated these marks. Yves Saint Laurent took over designing for Christian Dior in 1957, but when it came time to design his own label, he looked to the existing visual language, as did Dion van Furstenberg in the 1970s. So clearly now, borrowing from both brands and fashion editorial, Italian labels such as Pucci in the late 1940s, Missoni in 1953, and Armani in 1975 realized that no one was really deviating from that visual language. And it should be noted that not all of these are original logos, but they all did play with this typographic restraint at some point. Though Missoni is kind of a departure with this lower contrast Egyptian, but it's not a science. The newer guard of designers maintained that language, like Valentino and Ralph Lauren, Calvin Klein in 1968, Dolce & Gabbana in 1985. But notably, with the melding of downtown fashion here to stay, when Saint Laurent rebranded post-Yves, they used Helvetica. To me, this signifies a permanence to the notion that downtown fashion is as valuable as uptown fashion. Stylistically, and perhaps philosophically, there's a difference between Yves Saint Laurent and Saint Laurent. The transition within the label makes total sense. Yves was known for capturing a daring and an edge and a beauty simultaneously, and Saint Laurent has adapted to our time in a kind of perfect emulation of that spirit. Seeing this kind of leap is super exciting, and it makes things like Tom Ford's logo also make sense. Tom Ford became the creative director for Gucci in 1995, elevating the fashion house again after its brand became oversaturated. While Ford is known for this kind of ultimate sex and luxury, he's parked his logo in the camp of downtown, of new and innovative, of young but not immature, of beauty over youth. So it was kind of funny to me to see that Karl Lagerfeld branded himself like this, post-Tom Ford. Lagerfeld has been the creative director of Chanel since 1983 and Fendi since 1985, but when it came time to rebrand himself, he joined the side of that downtown edge, which can only be expected from a man that dapper who sports a white ponytail, which is a wink at Matthew Carter, by the way. So what can be determined from these grotesque choices? Essentially that the visual language of fashion has to be born from a maverick. No one is taking chances, but if one does make that jump and it's accepted, it's because the designer has gained an unprecedented level of respect early on, or it originates from a voice in the industry you'd be stupid to question. Either way, if you pull it off, 75 other houses will adopt what you've declared your own. Which brings us to how these labels are used graphically. Fashion was the first industry to understand that the value of its products could become synonymous and later be outvalued by the presence of the brand itself. I love this image because it's a diagram for spotting an authentic Louis Vuitton bag. Every little detail. It's its authenticity that matters, more than the fact that people just might really like that bag or that it matches a good part of their wardrobe or it's practical. Its authenticity has to do with its brand. Louis Vuitton started out this way for proprietary reasons as a leather goods house, but the status of ownership helped form this new kind of aristocracy, one for which the other aspects of the product become secondary. The interesting part to people about this bag is how the L and the V are appropriated in a new way, and that it's authentically Louis Vuitton, and therefore has value. All these other details are secondary. And the evolution or interpretation of the brand mark becomes the focus of the bag. So this is a good segue. Louis Vuitton established this tactic, and it was soon followed by many, many labels. This is Marc Jacobs, who was the creative director at Louis Vuitton from 1997 to 2014, extrapolating what he'd learned about the value of something being Louis Vuitton. It's an idea that was inspired by Steven Sprouse, who was responsible for this outfit many years earlier, and then whom Marc Jacobs asked later on to collaborate with. And they did this kind of graffiti of his own label on Louis Vuitton bags. So this proves our suspicions that what we really want is the label itself. He did this collaboration with Sprouse in 2001. This is a photographer, David Hughes, for Louis Vuitton, taking this idea and running with it. The branding of Louis Vuitton becomes distorted, purposely vandalized, and repurposed onto a figure, all of which we see before we even really notice the product. Louis Vuitton's willingness to create graphic forms out of their logo in order to reflect the luxury it claims to be has since led loads of designers to experiment with their logos graphically. This is Fendi with its iconic F pattern, which was designed by Karl Lagerfeld in 1965. And the following are all ways that Karl Lagerfeld tried to exploit the Chanel logo to this end. Chainsaw, hair clips, Lego Chanel bag, giant purse, tennis rackets, surfboards, beach balls, etc. But all of that doesn't really count as clothing per se. Those are examples of how type is graphic, and graphics can represent class and exclusivity. Moschino, the label, was founded in 1983 by Franco Moschino, who sought to, quote, disrupt the value system and bourgeois affectations of elitist fashion using Dada and pop art as his weapons of choice. Pop art, with its tongue-in-cheek immaturity, inflatable swim toys and blaring colors, comic type, and all of it, was then transferred onto clothing as an extension of the art movement. Moschino has always toyed with the graphic nature of large-scale mainstream branding. By subverting these common graphics and injecting them into high-end women's wear, conversations are started about our value systems themselves. This is Linda Evangelista, looking very Upper East Side, holding a very Chanel-looking bag that has McDonald's logo on it. This raincoat is by the artist Mimi Smith. So emulating plastic packaging as a plastic raincoat becomes a pretty loaded topic about the environment. And this is a corset made by Christine Lofazo. So corsets themselves also have contentious histories. How does that context change what the text says? The truth is, the marriage of type on clothing will always elevate the other's meaning. What does type mean once it's clothing someone? What does clothing mean when it's suddenly saying something? Aptly, there was a book published by the Met Costume Institute where I did some of my research for this talk entitled Wardrobe. They did a whole exhibition on clothing with type, with letters. And it opens with this quote, "On the breast of her gown in red cloth, surrounded with an elaborate embroidery and fantastic flourishes of gold thread, appeared the letter A. A letter on a body signifies something." So it's pretty natural for artists to play with this notion, how clothing expresses what's on the inside and how type is the most literal way to express what that expression is. In this same paper vein, the dress on the left was a gimmick to subscribe to the Echo newspaper in 1893, and on the right is a paper dress made to emulate the Yellow Pages around 1967. This print was designed by Elsa Schiaparelli, a designer from the 30s through 50s, and her work was shown in parallel with Mucce Prada's at the Costume Institute a few years ago. This is called ration coupon, and you can kind of see these little numbers interspersed as background texture, and those little numbers are a graphic language of wartime ration coupons, of course dating between 1940 and 1945. Schiaparelli had also designed a cellophane belt in 1936 that could be ordered with your name and phone number written on it as this ultimate expression of personal identity. But they're not all politically charged statements. I love this piece because it subverts the dress dummy itself, printing the utilitarian branding on it and everything. Some very personal feeling French handwriting used as concrete poetry. And some of these pieces are just art, and the letters are just familiar graphic shapes. A detail of a print and dress by Nettie Rosenstein from 1945. And this is an unknown label, it's French from the 20s, called Alphabet Lace Dress, and they attribute it also to concrete poetry because it means nothing. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that this was conceptual. Letters just make interesting shapes and patterns. This is a 90s version in ultra suede. And this was a Parsons student project, which was to use a found object to make a garment. I'm not sure what was the found object here. But even non-Latin global scripts, these are Chinese characters, still make those same familiar graphic shapes and patterns. So there are thousands of contemporary examples of type as graphic pattern in clothing today, and these are just a few. Moschino, I saw this on the train a few weeks ago on this parka. So they just become a graphic pattern. Nike released these Futura emblazoned sneakers. It's kind of the ultimate ode to downtown street style. It's a label called Six Pack France. And I'll leave you with this one. This is my favorite because of many of these images I dug through. in terms of its reverence for letters. The curator of wardrobe from the Costume Institute wrote, "Brilliantly of the pop art moment, but also the quaintly of the plantain type specimen and commercial copy past, this outfit that covers the body in letters seizes the initiative of the pop sensibility without sacrificing abstraction, achieved through all-over design." Gernreich equivocated here between the tabloid elements of pop and turn-of-the-century uses of typeface and lettering as rudimentary graphic art. A letter is an escapable and unambiguous sign, meant to be understood in one way and not in the other. But the appearance of letters out of order and repeated ensuite on a garment renders the unequivocal letter as something curiously fixed and uncertain. I don't think that's true. I think the guy saw a photo lettering type specimen and thought, wow, type is really beautiful. Thank you. I just want to say also thank you to Christian Schwartz, who lent me this typeface, Le Jeune, for this, and Chris Sowersby, who lent me his new version of Futura, and to my little muse, Francesca. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I have one question for you, and I wonder if you have any ideas of what might be next in fashion that might be inspired by type.
That might be inspired by type?
Yeah, or might use type in some of these ways that you've shown now.
Well, I think it's really interesting now, some of the experiments that are being done with 3D printing. So there's kind of a lot of possibilities with that graphic notion of type that could be made.
Nice. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. It was great.